The Great Question. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that every decision you've made, the job you chose, the people you love, the beliefs you defend with trembling conviction, may not have been yours to begin with. Imagine noticing that the voice narrating your life isn't yours, not really, but a patchwork of others. Parents whispering warnings from your childhood, society screaming what you should be, trauma reshaping your sense of worth in the shadows. You wake up, sit still, and it hits you, not like a lightning bolt, but like a slow, seeping poison, that your mind has been at war with itself for years, quietly, invisibly, strategically, and you didn't even know it. There's no bloodshed, no audible bombs, just the constant inner commentary. You're not good enough, you should have done better, don't say that, don't feel that, smile more, shrink less, want less, perform more. These aren't thoughts you consciously planted. They're invasive roots of something older, deeper, more cunning. And as the days stretch into decades, you begin to suspect a disturbing truth. You've been sabotaging yourself with tools you didn't create, fighting an internal enemy you cannot see, with weapons designed to keep you numb. What if your mind isn't your ally? What if the one thing you trust to interpret reality, your thoughts, is the most unreliable narrator of all? We like to believe we are coherent, singular beings, that there is an I, stable, sovereign, and sound, guiding our choices, navigating life with intent. But this assumption cracks when we look closer. Why do you flinch when someone raises their voice, even when it's not directed at you? Why do you feel shame for wanting rest, anger when you should be calm, paralysis when opportunity knocks? Why is your instinct to please when you want to protest, to escape when you crave connection, to judge yourself even as you long for grace? These aren't logical reactions. These are ancient echoes, psychological reflexes shaped in the dark, behind your awareness, playing out like ghost scripts you never wrote. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That is the silent war. Not the fight between you and the world, but the battle between your conscious self, the one that reads, reflects, aspires, and the unconscious machinery that pulls your strings when you're not looking. This war doesn't show up on your calendar, and it won't appear in your therapy notes as hostilities commenced. It begins the moment your psyche splits, when you bury the parts of yourself deemed unacceptable, unlovable, inconvenient. Your sadness? Too weak. Your anger? Too dangerous. Your joy? Too loud. So they get pushed into the basement of your being, forming what Jung called the shadow. Not evil, not wrong, just the rejected, the unseen, the unspoken. And what is repressed doesn't die, it schemes. But here's the paradox. What you repress owns you. What you deny controls you. What you silence becomes the loudest force in your life. Every time you abandon yourself to fit in, a scar forms. Every time you stay quiet to be liked, a little battlefield inside you expands. You call it stress, anxiety, imposter syndrome. But these are only the smoke. The fire is deeper. The real conflict is identity versus expectation, desire versus duty, authenticity versus acceptance. The war isn't external, it's internal. And it's not loud, it's silent, because you've normalized it, you've been trained to. No one ever taught you that being at war with your own thoughts is not normal, that hating yourself for being tired is not strength, that burning out for approval is not purpose. The culture you live in celebrates the performance, not the person. It honors productivity, not peace. Contros. L, not consciousness. So you move through life managing symptoms, not the cause. You read self-help books to feel motivated, not whole. You meditate to calm the chaos, not question its source. You smile in photos but wonder why you feel like you're watching your own life from the outside, like a ghost trapped behind your own eyes. And maybe, just maybe, you've started to suspect that something beneath the surface is deeply, relentlessly wrong. But if this war is real, if you are both the battlefield and the soldier, then what's the end game? Can you ever win? Can you ever find peace with a mind that's turned into its own enemy? Or is this simply the cost of being human, an eternal tension between who you are and who you were told to be? Before we can answer that, we must descend further. We must ask a deeper question, not just what is fighting inside you, but why? Who benefits from your inner division? How did this fragmentation begin? And what ancient philosophies and modern psychologies saw this long before you did? Let's go deeper. The hidden problem. Its psychological philosophical roots. To understand the silent war, we must trace the battlefield back to its origins. Not in adulthood where symptoms surface, but in the fragile architecture of childhood, where your mind was still soft clay, malleable and porous. Before you had language to describe pain, you had sensations. Before you understood society's rules, you had instincts. But instincts are dangerous in a world obsessed with obedience. So slowly, silently, you were taught to betray your impulses. Crying too much? Be quiet. Asking too many questions? Be still. Angry at injustice? Be polite. You weren't punished for being bad. You were punished for being too real, too raw, too human. So you learned to adapt. You cut away pieces of yourself to be accepted, not because you were weak, but because you were smart. Your survival depended on it. And in that adaptive brilliance, the fragmentation began. Carl Jung called this the birth of the persona, the mask you wear to navigate the world, crafted from the traits rewarded by your environment. You smiled when you were sad. You nodded when you disagreed. You excelled not to fulfill your soul, but to earn love. And all the while, the parts of you that didn't fit the mold were exiled. They didn't disappear. They became the shadow. This hidden dimension of your psyche isn't evil. It's everything about you that you couldn't afford to show. Your unmet needs, your repressed rage, your forbidden fantasies, your raw grief. This is not merely psychology. This is spiritual exile. You are a soul that learned to amputate its own limbs in exchange for safety. Now imagine walking through life unaware of this inner split. You grow older, you succeed, maybe even thrive on paper, but the deeper you go, the more hollow it feels. Achievements don't satisfy, relationships don't heal. You sabotage opportunities, attract chaos, repeat patterns you swore you'd escape. You think it's bad luck, low self-esteem, maybe karma, but really it's the war. The rejected self clawing its way into your present, screaming through your anxiety, whispering through your depression, sabotaging your peace, not to harm you, but to be seen. The mind rebels when wholeness is denied. Enter Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who claimed that human life is governed not by reason, but by an insatiable will. A blind, unconscious force that compels desire, creates suffering, and keeps us enslaved to illusions. He believed that suffering is not an error of existence, it is existence. The will wants, consumes, wants again, and when it doesn't get what it wants, it punishes you. This will lives deep within the unconscious mind. It's not logical, it's primal, and it doesn't care if your desires destroy you, as long as it keeps desiring. Schopenhauer saw this for what it is, not weakness, but a structural feature of the human psyche, the seat. Trap isn't in wanting, it's in never questioning who wants. And so you drift through life serving masters you've never met, your shadow, your will, your persona, all while believing you are one self, in control, making rational decisions. But Jung warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. That avoidance is the silent war's main strategy. Distraction, denial, perfectionism, projection. These are not flaws, they're shields. They keep the war underground, and society helps. In fact, it thrives on your fragmentation. Think of it. A person at war with themselves is the perfect consumer. They seek fulfillment through things. They numb with entertainment, buy to feel worthy, work to prove they're enough. A divided mind is easier to manipulate. It questions itself constantly, doubts its instincts, follows trends, obeys norms, avoids rebellion. As Aldous Huxley warned in Brave New World, we will be so sedated by pleasure, so conditioned by comfort, that we won't even notice our chains. We'll call them preferences. We love our servitude, he wrote. That's the horror. Not that you're controlled, but that you consent to it without knowing. This is not just theory. Neuroscience backs it. Studies show that much of our decision-making occurs in the unconscious brain before we're even aware of it. Your mind has scripts, heuristics, trauma responses that get triggered before your conscious self even enters the room. You think you choose, but often you react. And then you justify your reaction with a story that feels logical. But it's just a cover. The war has already been waged. You're explaining the ruins. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, believed that the greatest curse and gift of human consciousness is freedom. We are condemned to be free, he said. Unlike animals, we cannot rely on instinct alone. We must choose. And in choosing it, we define ourselves. But that freedom is terrifying, so we flee it. We hide behind roles, religions, ideologies, addictions, anything to avoid the unbearable responsibility of shaping our own essence. This evasion, Sartre said, is bad faith, and it fuels the war within, because your soul knows when you're lying to yourself, and it does not forget. Now add the trauma, childhood wounds, betrayals, losses, emotional neglect. These experiences don't just hurt, they program you. They teach your nervous system to see the world as unsafe, love as dangerous, rest as lazy. You internalize shame. You wire your brain for hypervigilance, self-rejection, overachievement. Trauma creates protective patterns that later become prisons. And because trauma is stored somatically, in the body, it bypasses reason. You can't think your way out. You must feel your way through. But the culture fears feelings, so instead of healing, you cope. You distract, you suppress, and the war rages on. So here you are, consciously craving peace, unconsciously repeating pain, a divided self pulled in opposite directions, haunted by the shadow you exiled, enslaved to the will you don't understand, seduced by a society that profits from your fragmentation. And still, you wonder why you feel exhausted, why happiness feels counterfeit, why your mind feels like a minefield. But knowing this is not enough. Awareness without transformation is just another layer of torment. The question now is, what does this war do to you over time? How does it shape your reality, your identity, your fate, without you ever realizing it? Let's pull back the veil. The unseen consequences. You don't see it at first. The war doesn't announce itself with grand tragedies or visible wounds. It whispers, it leaks, it reshapes the architecture of your mind slowly, like erosion, quiet, patient, absolute. And one day, without knowing when, it began. You wake up inside a life that feels alien. You smile, but it feels rehearsed. You speak, but your words echo as if spoken through glass. You look in the mirror and feel an eerie detachment, not from your body, but from the personhood inside it. And perhaps the most terrifying part? Everyone thinks you're fine, because the war inside doesn't leave bruises. It leaves patterns, invisible chains wrapped in routine. This is how the silent war metastasizes, not through breakdowns, but through the slow death of authenticity. You learn to function so well that your dysfunction becomes invisible to others and eventually to yourself. You work hard, but it's fueled by a fear of inadequacy, not passion. You love, but it's anxious, performative, rooted in a fear of abandonment. You rest, but never truly relax, because guilt and shame linger like a shadow just behind your eyelids. You begin to define yourself not by your essence, but by your usefulness. How productive you are, how pleasant you seem, how palatable your existence is to others. You've become a reflection, not a self. Cognitive science offers a name for part of this distortion: confirmation bias. Once your unconscious mind adopts a belief, I am unworthy, the world is unsafe, I must earn love, it begins filtering reality to confirm it. You dismiss praise, you spotlight rejection, you attract situations that reinforce the very wounds you wish to escape. Not out of masochism, but because the familiar pain feels safer than unknown peace. The mind clings to the known, even if it kills you slowly. This is how trauma becomes identity. Neuroscience deepens the horror. The brain, designed for survival, not truth, prioritizes efficiency. It builds neural pathways around repeated experiences, especially emotionally intense ones. If, for instance, you grew up needing to suppress your anger to stay safe, your brain wires around that pattern. Later in life, expressing anger feels unsafe, even if it's necessary or justified. The circuitry says, danger, not expression. So you swallows your voice again and again until your silence feels noble instead of suffocating. The war rewrites your instincts. But this war doesn't stop with the self. It leaks into every relationship. When you're fragmented inside, connection feels risky. Vulnerability threatens the persona. Intimacy awakens the shadow. You either cling too tightly, fearing abandonment, or you keep everyone at a safe distance, fearing exposure. You seek in others what you've exiled in yourself: validation, strength, wholeness. But once found, it feels unbearable. You sabotage, you ghost, you chase, you settle. All the while, telling yourself stories to make it feel rational. They weren't the right person. I just need more space. Love isn't for me. But beneath it all, it's the war dictating your terms. Over time, the consequences evolve. Your body begins to speak. Chronic tension, digestive issues, panic attacks, insomnia, fatigue that sleep cannot fix. As Gabor Mate has shown, the mind and body are not separate. Suppressed emotion, repressed trauma, and self-alienation manifest physically. The war doesn't just exhaust your spirit, it hijacks your biology. Autoimmune conditions, adrenal fatigue, inflammatory diseases, all can be tied to long-term psychological stress, especially when the psyche is locked in a loop of self-denial and hypervigilance. The body becomes the battlefield's map, marked not with flags, but with symptoms. And yet, despite all of this, you still seek healing in surface solutions. You buy books on confidence, but don't ask why you feel so fragile. You chase spiritual highs without facing emotional lows. You fill your days with productivity to silence the emptiness. This isn't healing, it's avoidance. The shadow, denied expression, becomes passive-aggressive. It leaks into your judgments, your sarcasm, your envy. You lash out not because others deserve it, but because your buried self wants to be seen, any way it can. You criticize what you secretly crave. You mock what you deeply fear. You resent those who live freely because they mirror the freedom you've denied yourself. The war hides in projection. Now look outward. Society itself is structured around this internal division. Think of the systems we uphold: educational, corporate, religious. They reward conformity, not self-awareness. They prize obedience over introspection. From a young age, you are taught what to think, not how to think. You are fed identities: student, citizen, employee, spouse, but rarely encouraged to explore who you are beneath the roles. When people deviate from the script, they're labeled difficult, unstable, rebellious. But maybe they're just trying to end the war inside. Maybe madness is misunderstood liberation. As Michel Foucault argued, society often defines sanity as alignment with power. But what if the truly sane are those who refuse to play the game? And consider how this fragmentation creates a culture of performance. Social media accelerates the war by rewarding appearances over authenticity. You don't post your true self, you curate an image. You don't share confusion, you share clarity. You brand your life. And the more people applaud the mask, the more the mask becomes your prison. You gain followers but lose intimacy. You gain attention but lose peace. You begin to live as if constantly watched, and the shadow again is forced deeper underground. Eventually, something breaks. A burnout, a breakdown, a divorce, a crisis that shatters the illusion. And in that raw, disoriented space, you catch a glimpse of something you've long forgotten. Not just the pain, but the possibility. Because here lies the paradox. The war inside is not a punishment. It is a signal, a summons, a call from the parts of you that still believe integration is possible, that beneath the layers of performance and protection lies a self that is not broken but buried, not shattered but silenced. And so we arrive at the threshold. Knowing now that the war has shaped your thoughts, your relationships, your body, your culture, what will you do? Can you live like this any longer? Can you continue numbing the ache, performing the lie, swallowing the rage? Or is there another way? What happens if instead of fighting the war, you walk into it, unarmed, unguarded, awake? because now comes the rebellion. The rebellion, how to break free. There comes a moment in every silent war when the soldier must decide. Continue obeying orders from an invisible commander, or put the weapon down, step off the battlefield, and walk toward the unknown. This moment doesn't arrive in fanfare. It often begins quietly, during a sleepless night, a tear shed alone, a sudden revulsion at your own reflection. It begins when your suffering becomes so loud that it drowns out your excuses, when you stop defending your pain. That is the moment of rebellion. And unlike what you've been taught, rebellion doesn't always look like fire and fury. Sometimes it's whispering no to a lifetime of yes. Sometimes it's choosing rest over achievement, stillness over noise, truth over comfort. And the first act of rebellion is radical self-honesty. You begin by admitting what you've long denied, that the war is real, and that you are both its victim and its general. You take inventory not of your achievements, but of your masks. Who have you been performing for? What parts of you did you exile to be loved? What wounds have you mistaken for personality traits? This self-inquiry is not indulgent, it is liberation. As Socrates once declared, the unexamined life is not worth living. But the examined life? It's terrifying, because you will unearth grief you never processed, rage you've been taught to fear, dreams you buried to survive. But to feel is to remember you are still alive beneath the numbness. Next comes the reintegrati, born of the shadow. Carl Jung didn't advise destroying the shadow, he warned against it. He insisted that true transformation requires embracing it. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. You do not become whole by deleting parts of yourself. You become whole by meeting your exiled selves with compassion. You sit with your jealousy, your envy, your laziness, your rage, not to justify them, but to understand them. Every unwanted emotion is a messenger. Anger may be telling you where your boundaries were violated. Sadness may be mourning a life unlived. Fear may be protecting a wound that never healed. When you listen without judgment, the shadow softens. It stops screaming. It begins to speak. But this rebellion doesn't stop at introspection. It demands action. You begin making different choices, not because you've been told to, but because your soul demands it. You quit the job that drains you, even if it terrifies you. You speak the truth in a relationship, even if it risks abandonment. You rest without guilt. You create without needing it to be perfect. You allow yourself to be seen, not as a curated persona, but as a flawed, living human. Every act of authenticity is a bullet through the illusion. And yes, it may cost you. Some people will not understand the new you. They were in love with your mask, not your essence, but let them leave. The people who matter will stay, or they will arrive when your soul finally has room to breathe. Consider Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the one who overcomes not others, but the self. He spoke of transcending herd morality, of becoming who you truly are, rather than who the world wants you to be. But this isn't egoism, it's courage. The courage to stand alone, to think differently, to break away from inherited narratives. Nietzsche didn't just admire strength, he admired the strength it takes to forge meaning in a meaningless world. That's the rebellion. You stop outsourcing your identity. You stop waiting for someone else to give your life purpose. You create it. You become the artist of your own psyche. In practice, this rebellion is messy. Healing is not a straight line. You will regress. You will doubt. You will sabotage. But each fall is not failure. It is friction. And friction is how new neural pathways are built. Neuroscience confirms what ancient mystics intuited. The brain remains plastic. New habits can be formed, new beliefs installed. But repetition is key. Meditation is one tool, not to escape thoughts, but to witness them. Journaling helps give voice to the unconscious. Movement, breathwork, somatic therapies all help rewire the body, which holds the trauma. Healing isn't just mental, it's embodied. Your nervous system must learn that peace is not dangerous, that joy is not a setup for pain, that safety exists inside you. not just outside. And then there is meaning. Viktor Frankl, who survived the horrors of Auschwitz, wrote that those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. Meaning is what transforms pain from chaos into purpose. It is the rebellion's guiding star. You begin asking deeper questions, not just what do I want, but why? Not just what am I running from, but what am I running toward? Purpose isn't a career, it's a direction of the soul. It's how you use your wounds. Maybe you write, maybe you teach, maybe you create spaces for others to heal. Whatever it is, it must emerge from truth, not performance, from love, not lack. You also begin to rehumanize others. When you make peace with your own shadow, you become less reactive to theirs. You stop needing to control everyone around you. You see behind their masks, their projections, their wounds. And this is how compassion grows, not from moral superiority, but from shared fragility. You begin healing relationships not by fixing others, but by becoming safe. Enough that others feel they don't need to wear their armor around you. This is how personal rebellion becomes collective healing. And most of all, you reclaim time. Not clock time, but soul time. You stop rushing. You stop measuring your worth in output. You remember how to sit in silence, how to listen, how to be, because in that stillness, something extraordinary begins to unfold. Not the end of the war, but the birth of a new relationship to it. You realize that the goal was never to destroy the shadow, but to learn from it. That pain wasn't your enemy. It was your map. That your mind, once your prison, is also your cathedral. And the rebellion? It was never about fighting harder. It was about surrendering to something deeper, wiser, eternal. Now you begin to see the truth, not the comfortable one, the real one. And that truth, raw, sacred, undeniable, will change everything. The ultimate truth, the final, most powerful realization. There is a moment, after the rebellion, after the masks have cracked and the shadows have been embraced, when silence returns. But this time it's not the silence of suppression. It's not the silence of avoidance, guilt, or self-betrayal. It's a different kind of stillness, deeper, heavier, reverent, as if the soul has finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. And in this silence, something reveals itself, not as an answer, but as a presence. You begin to understand the ultimate truth of the war inside your mind, that it was never meant to be won. It was meant to be understood. The war you fought, the tension, the division, the spirals of doubt and denial, was not a flaw in your design. It was your design. A sacred tension placed inside you not to destroy, but to awaken. This is the paradox that undoes everything. The very suffering you sought to eliminate is what carried the wisdom you were born to remember. The chaos was not the enemy. It was the curriculum, the depression, the anxiety, the shame, the loneliness. They were not just symptoms. They were encrypted messages, each one asking you to return to something ancient inside yourself, something you had forgotten. And here it is. The silent war inside your mind is not a malfunction. It is a spiritual rite of passage. Carl Jung knew this. He described the individuation process as the unfolding of the self through integration of the unconscious. Not a linear path, but a spiral, a descent into madness, illusion, darkness, and shadow, only to emerge not as a perfected being, but a whole one. A self who knows their darkness and has befriended it. A soul who no longer fears contradiction because they understand that to be human is to be a contradiction, yearning for freedom while clinging to safety, seeking love while hiding vulnerability, desiring truth while avoiding pain. The peace you craved doesn't come from eliminating these tensions. It comes from holding them all without collapsing. This is the final transformation. You no longer need to win the war. You no longer see the mind as your enemy. You see it as a mirror, a teacher, a storm, a story still being told. You no longer chase perfection. You no longer apologize for your complexity. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What is life trying to show me through this?" You see now that every trigger is a flashlight, every breakdown a breakthrough, every conflict a cracked mirror showing you another fragment of your forgotten self. And something else happens, something subtle but seismic. The voice in your mind changes. It softens. It becomes less of a judge and more of a guide. less of a drill sergeant, more of a poet. You start speaking to yourself the way you always wished others would, with compassion, with curiosity, with presence. And in doing so, you become the parent you needed, the lover you longed for, the healer you spent years seeking. The war subsides, not because it was won, but because it is no longer necessary. You understand. But now what Schopenhauer hinted at when he spoke of transcendence through aesthetic contemplation, how beauty, art, and silence momentarily free us from the tyranny of the will. You find peace not in escaping desire, but in observing it without attachment. You realize that thoughts are clouds, not the sky. Emotions are waves, not the ocean. You begin to live from the center, the unmoved mover within you, where consciousness itself resides. This is not theory. It's a felt sense, an unshakable knowing. You don't just think differently. You are different, and no one can take that from you. But here's the sacred irony. Even as you transcend the war, you feel more human than ever, more alive. You laugh more, cry more, feel more. You stop performing healing and actually start living it. And it shows. People feel it in your presence. They sense the depth behind your eyes, not just intelligence, but integration. You no longer need to fix others. You no longer rush to rescue or correct. You simply hold space. And in doing so, you become a quiet revolutionary. Not with banners or hashtags, but with your being. Because a healed mind doesn't just free itself, it frees others too. This is how transformation ripples outward. It begins in the dark, within a single mind battling itself. But when that mind awakens, when it stops warring and starts listening, it sends out a frequency, a resonance. And others, exhausted by their own wars, feel it. They soften. They question. They begin. The healing becomes contagious, and one by one, a new kind of consciousness emerges. Not perfect, not enlightened, just real people, walking through a broken world with open hearts and clear eyes, no longer seeking to dominate or escape, but to understand. And maybe that's what this was all for, not to become better, but to become truer. So where do you go from here? Not back to the performance, not back to the numbness. You walk forward, even if slowly. You choose presence, even when it hurts. You stay awake, even when the dream of unconsciousness calls you back. Because now you know the cost of sleepwalking through your own life. You've paid that price in tears, in years, in silence, never again. You begin creating a life rooted in what's real, not what's expected. You make space for joy without guilt. You grieve without shame. You set boundaries without apology. You create without comparison. You love without possession. And perhaps most importantly, you stop waiting for the right time, the right version of yourself, the right permission. You act now, not because you are ready, but because you are alive. And the mind, the same mind that once enslaved you, it becomes your companion, your canvas, your compass, not always quiet, but always known, not always kind, but always visible. And visibility, after all, is the opposite of war. To see is to end the conflict, because now you know. The war was never a punishment. It was the prelude to your awakening. And that is the silent truth no one told you. Until now.